Okay, kids, it's time for another episode of the Fueled by Weird podcast, the only podcast where we won't have to go coast to coast to find our space ghost. I'm Chris Daly, and today I have the pleasure of chatting with Ringo Award-winning writer David Pepose. David, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you so much for having me on the show. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about my new book at Dynamite Entertainment, Space Ghost. Issue one is coming out May 1st, and I'm excited to tell you all about it.
I'm super stoked. So before we get to that, because we're definitely going to get to that, I usually like to start these things off with an icebreaker question. So
Sure.
today's question is, if you had to eat a crayon, what color would you choose?
Hmm. What crayon would I eat?
If you had to
Uh,
pick one,
yeah. Well, I'm gonna cheat and say a strawberry flavored crayon. There you go.
that works.
Something.
You
Yeah.
found the loophole.
Found the loophole. I'm sure that they do not make flavored crayons for the purposes of lots of small children eating them. So yeah, I guess if I had to eat a crayon, I guess it would be red.
Ooh, that's a good one. I think green or blue probably would be for me. I don't
Yeah.
have a reason why,
And then you're
just
gonna like trick yourself into thinking it's sour apple or blue raspberry. No, I see where like the rationale is
yep.
for all of this. But
Yeah, I'm glad we could find some rationale in this crazy question.
yeah, yeah, or just like eat a whole bunch of them and then try to make art out of it. I don't know.
There you go.
Um, Yeah, I guess that would all just turn into brown. It's not like it would turn into anything rainbows. Um,
That's true.
yeah, can you tell I've been like working on a script all day? But yes, I guess red or whatever the most nutritional value color crayon there is.
There you go. Perfect. All right. So, with the concept of fueled by weird, it's, the things that you're into, your hobbies, your interests, all that stuff that make you who you are. So essentially that's what fuels your weird. So, David, what are the things that fuel your weird?
Boy, that's a great question. Obviously I'm a huge comics fan. I'm a third
Sure.
generation comics reader, and
Sure.
that's been like my passion since I was like 5 years old. Yeah, I'm also, I like to watch a lot of movies, a lot of TV. A lot of my work is kind of infused with various strains of pop culture, so that's where I tend to get a lot of that from. Um, yeah, occasionally I'll dig into some video games, although I feel like I'm kind of neither fish nor fowl. There's a lot of games that are more casual that I'm not good enough to play, and then the more immersive story games, I think they get too immersive, and then I don't do my work. I had a brief flirtation with Baldur's Gate 3 that had to be put to bed pretty quick
Oh boy.
because I had deadlines that I had to hit. I couldn't keep playing the same game. But yeah, and then just kind of, you know, watching the world, as it goes. So yeah, I guess it's not really the sexiest answer, but yeah, just kind of absorbing pop culture all around and then just remixing it into my work the best I can.
Right on. And that's a perfect answer because no answers are going to be the same. There doesn't have to be an exciting answer, just whatever you're into. That works.
Yeah.
Right on. All right. Well, so we had mentioned you're a script writer, you're a comic writer, you're just a writer in general. What
Sure.
was it initially that got you interested in becoming a writer?
I kind of fell into it a little bit backwards. I
Okay.
grew up in the Midwest, so I did not really have like a whole lot of creative role models, so to speak. And so I had bounced around with a lot of different jobs that were almost tangential to where I wound up. I wound up I was a newspaper reporter for a while. I freelanced at newsarama.com as the reviews editor for a long time. So I was in the comics journalism scene. I went back to school for publishing. I wound up working in publicity for over at CBS. So a lot of kind of jobs that were almost but not quite in the creative field. And somebody had told me, somebody who graduated from college who had been working at FX at the time, she said, if you really want to do anything in Hollywood that's creative, you should come out to Los Angeles. And so at the time, I thought I wanted to work in what's called development or current programming for some networks, where You're basically, you're the executive that's working with creators to try to get the next show on the air and out the door.
Yeah.
And then current programming is sort of when they hand that off, like, sort of the show's on the air, and then you're the executive that's kind of looking at all the other episodes as they're coming out. And I thought at the time, oh, well, if I can prove that I can break down a story, that might be able to kind of get my foot in the door. And so I wrote my first book, Spencer and Locke, and I I continue to be blown away by the response to that book. And I realized at that moment, oh, I've been putting the cart before the horse the entire time. Like, why should I jump through hoops and grueling Hollywood assistant jobs for work that's only kind of tangentially related to the creative work?
Yeah.
Whereas I could just be doing the creative work. And so, yeah, my first book came out and people seem to really like that. And so I've been working on book after since. So yeah, it wasn't really anything intentional. I really just kind of dipped my toe into the pool enough times that I fell in the deep end.
Sure.
But thankfully I think I've learned how to swim. So yeah, it's definitely the hardest job I've ever had, the most involving job I've ever had, but it's also I think the most rewarding. Once you kind of figure out how to make that story click and you start writing it out and you start kind of getting to know the characters, it really is unlike any other job I've ever done, and it's certainly the best job in the world.
That's awesome. So, with, the comics you've written several of your own characters. You've written, for stories for a lot of big characters that we all know and love for years.
Yeah.
Do you have any that you haven't had a chance to write for that you would like to write for?
Sure. Yeah, there's a few. Doctor Strange is kind of my bucket list Marvel
Ooh,
character.
nice.
Although Jed McKay is doing such a spectacular job, I am in
Mhm.
no rush for him to go anywhere on that book. But I've told everybody at Marvel who will possibly listen to me that hey, like if that ever happens, let me know. War Machine is another one. He'd be really fun to do a story with. Um, I did one story with Peter Parker that that was a real career highlight. He's my favorite character in fiction. I'd love to do more with him.
Sure.
Um, yeah, there's a few. There are various X-related characters that would be fun, and that's not even including anybody at DC. I mean Superman, Shazam, Batman, Lobo, Etrigan, Firestorm, Doctor Fate, the Justice League, Seven Soldiers. I mean, there's so many great characters over at DC, that any of them would be super fun. Um, yeah, Captain Planet was my white whale for a long time.
That would be cool.
I don't. It's funny. Like I think I guess my career has changed a little bit since I've been saying that, but I still feel like I've got a fun concept for Captain Planet. So yeah, if that license ever happens, I'd love to do that.
That'd be
But
cool.
yeah, I've been very fortunate in that, especially on the Marvel side of the pond, besides a handful of characters, I've had a chance to really play with all of the toys that I would like to play with at least once. But I would never say no to playing with them again.
Nice. So I want to ask this now, and I usually ask this question to people who have dabbled on both sides of the fence of writing, pre-established IPs versus your own IPs.
Sure.
Um, what experience have you had between the two? Do you have a preference as which one you go with? Like, what's been your experience?
Yeah, well, it's all very different muscle groups.
Yeah,
I consider licensed books to be more of a sprint, whereas I think creator-owned original stuff is a little bit more of a marathon. Because
sure.
when you're doing creator-owned work, first off, nobody's asking you to do this. So I think
Yeah.
it often is a little harder to get something across the plate, because nobody's saying, oh, hey, like uh, 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 we need a Moon Knight miniseries and we want you to write it. Do you have any ideas? Like at that point, like half the work's already done.
Yeah.
Whereas creator owned, nobody's saying, hey, like, I want this book that's what if Calvin and Hobbes grew up in Sin City? You essentially have to like convince somebody that they
Yeah.
want that. And so and there's the you have to put together your own team a lot of the times, and so there's a lot of project management that goes into it.
Sure.
But creatively, you really you get to do whatever you want. As long as it kind of fits with the story math adds up, you can kind of do whatever you feel like. Whereas with licensed work, on the one hand, it's more research driven, like you read a whole bunch of XYZ character that you're writing, or whatever the franchise that you're working on. However, there's often a degree of, you have to, there are both the story math that you gotta nail down, but also you have to make sure that you're coloring within the lines of what the licensor needs. So sometimes if it's a case for Marvel, say, you'll be like, oh, hey, this character would really fit this thing that I really want to do. And sometimes that character is available. Other times somebody else is using that character, or that character has been used recently, or they're not a big enough character that they could really be in two places at once. And so you have to
Yeah.
think a little more creatively
Mm,
about, okay, like how do I kind of get the same effect but with a different character? And so uh, that's something that you won't know until you bring it up to your editors.
sure.
That's half their job. Well, maybe not half, but that's a big part of their job. It's just they're the traffic cops. They kind of know what everybody else is doing. They know where all the bodies are buried.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it can be a little bit of 20 questions where you're kind of like, okay, I know that happened, with my Punisher miniseries, is like there were certain characters that I had asked for, or I'd said, hey, is this character like the owl, for example? I was like, hey, is the owl available? And that's when I found out, like, oh, actually, the owl is going to be appearing pretty prominently in this Amazing Spider-Man event, Gang War. So, is there another character that can kind of fit the same role? And so, knowing those universes backwards and forwards is a real help. Because
Sure.
then I can say, oh, well, what about the offer from Paul Cornell's Wolverine run? I know nobody's using him, and so we were able to use him instead. Um, but at the same time, that also means like you're not having to develop a character whole cloth. Like if anything, you're reading everybody else's takes, and you're figuring out what stands out to you and what speaks to you, and what are some, common threads that you're seeing pop up. And it's very much a subjective thing. Like my take on Moon Knight is very different than Jed McKay's take on Moon Knight, which is
Sure.
very different than Warren Ellis's take, which is very different than Charlie Huston's take, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think they're very different. I think I will say licensed work tends, well, I think that's by the nature of the piece, is that licensed work tends to work faster, because it's a publisher. They typically know we need this book, or we want this book, and they've already approached you to say, hey, we want your take on it. And so usually that means like, okay, we got to get to the get things going. You have a couple weeks to kind of come up with an outline, and then a couple weeks after that, have your first script in, and then your editors will put together your team. And having an editor put together a team is often very useful, because artists are having so many competing interests for their time and their attention, that having self-financed my own projects, those tend to take a little longer. That it's usually they've got their own day job going on, but also like if they're late for me, it's not gonna do anything to their career. Like,
Yeah.
whereas if you're late for Tom Brevoort, that might have some repercussions down the line. So yeah, I think that's kind of the differences. But honestly, the when you're in a good spot is when you're balancing both. Like something that the creators have always told me is like try to make time for creator owned work as often as you can, just because licensed work does come in ebbs and flows. And being able to kind of be able to do both is really a way that you can endure in this career path.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when it comes to those creator-owned IPs, and I ask this question too because it usually ends up being slightly different with everybody. Do you take a story idea to, X publishers, they have a story idea for this character, or do they say, hey, we want you to write this is the story we have in
It's
mind for this
usually
character?
well, so it's more towards the latter. So for example, when I started working Marvel, I've been there a little less than 3 years.
Mhm.
And when they first approached me, they said, hey, we're looking to relaunch Savage Avengers, and we thought you might be a good fit for it. Do you have any ideas? And and same thing with like Moon Knight City of the Dead. They said, hey, we're looking to do more Moon Knight content. We know you're a fan of Moon Knight. If you had 5 issues, what would you do with it? And sometimes certain assignments can be a little bit more structured than others. For example, like when I did my Punisher miniseries, my editor Tom Brevoort, he had some ideas of some elements that he thought might be a good fit for our new Punisher, and then we
Yeah.
kind of bounced those ideas off, and so we kept some of them, and there were some other ideas that we took some new twists on. Um, but yeah, as far as pitching editors of like, hey, like I have this idea on this character, um, that hasn't been my experience yet. It's not to say that that doesn't happen on occasion.
Sure.
Uh, you probably have to be a little further along than I am, but yeah, I mean, I've certainly done it. I mean, there have definitely been characters that I have thrown my hat in the ring. But yeah, usually unless the editors are saying, "Hey, we have need of a Moon Knight miniseries," it's usually them coming to you rather than the other way around.
That makes sense. All right. So now we're going to talk about Space Ghost.
Sure.
So let's start off by, Space Ghost, obviously. I grew up as a fan of Space Ghost, not originally, but I caught like the replays and stuff because I'm
Yeah.
not that old. I didn't catch it when it first came out, but
Right. Me either.
yeah. And my first introduction to Space Ghost was with Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which I'm sure a
Sure.
lot of people had the same kind of experience.
Yeah, me too.
So for those that aren't familiar with Space Ghost, do you want to talk a little bit about, who Space
Yeah.
Ghost is?
Sure. Yeah. If all you know of Space Ghost is him as a talk show host, that really is like the tip of the iceberg
Yeah,
for that character.
sure.
He was created by the legendary artist Alex Toth for Hanna-Barbera, and he came out the same year as Adam West's Batman. So I see him as having a lot of shared DNA with classic Batman,
Oh, for
a lot
sure.
of similar imagery to Superman. I even see certain connective tissue with like Iron Man because
Okay.
Space Ghost has so much tech in
Yeah.
the arsenal. And then also kind of like the high flying sci-fi of like a Flash Gordon or even like a Star Wars. But Space Ghost's whole deal is that he's a superhero of the cosmos. He's armed with his power bands, which are two gauntlets that give him laser powers, control over fire and ice. They give him force fields. He also has what's called an Inviso-Belt, which allows him to turn invisible. So he gets to live up to his name as the Space Ghost. And Space Ghost fights all sorts of iconic villains like Zorak and Brak and Moltar and the Council of Doom. And he teams up with his three sidekicks. They're teenagers, teenage twins, Jan and Jace, and their pet monkey Blip. And so the four of them together wind up solving all sorts of like cool, exciting sci-fi superhero action like across the galaxy. And there's just this deep bench of iconic villains for them to fight. And so when I approached this book, when Dynamite approached me about taking on Space Ghost, and as I rewatched all the original episodes, um, for me, I saw this wealth of potential because all those
Sure.
original cartoons, they're 5 minutes a pop, maybe
Yeah.
6 minutes at most.
Hmm.
There's no continuity whatsoever. There's no backstory. Space Ghost just shows up completely fully formed with three sidekicks, and he's fighting a lava monster, and there's really very little opportunity to dig into these characters' motivations or their psychology. They really relied a lot on the energy, like the frantic pacing of these episodes, and Alex Toth's designs. You see like an evil praying mantis like Zorak, and you kind of get a sense of like, oh, okay, I see kind of what his deal is,
Yeah.
uh, versus like an armored hulking figure like Metalis.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was, the original Space Ghost felt very much a product of its time. Like the camp was very much in for
Oh, for sure.
superheroes at the time. And so for me, it was how do we kind of take that energy and those archetypical characters and bring them into 2024 and redo these stories with sort of that 21st century storytelling sensibility. And so we're really kind of taking the comics format and digging way deeper than anyone really has ever been able to go. And we're going to be exploring Space Ghost and his universe in a series of done in one stories. So that way, every month when you pick up this book, you're going to get a self-contained story. And
That's
that way, if you don't know who Space Ghost is, we're going to kind of rack up those adventures very, very quickly. So you get to know him and his supporting cast very, very well.
that's awesome. So how did this whole process of, getting your hands on a Space Ghost book, how did that all come together?
Sure. Well, so I've known Nick Barucci at Dynamite for about 15 years.
Mhm.
I've known him since the beginning of my comic journalism days. And so when I finally took the plunge to become a writer, I would email Dynamite. Just that tends to happen when you start coming out with books, is you start
Sure.
emailing other editors and just saying,
Yeah.
hey, like this is my calling card. And if you see anything that you think might be a good fit, I hope you'll keep me in mind. And and it winds up helping like when you wind up taking on higher profile assignments. And so when I did Moon Knight, City of the Dead, and then Punisher back to back at Marvel, uh, Dynamite had sort of decided that I had hit that critical mass, and that they thought it would be nice to do a project together. And they had just announced that they had done a partnership with Warner Brothers Discovery for a whole bunch of Warner Brothers licensed books. Declan Shalvey and Drew Moss on Thundercats had just been announced at New York Comic Con as sort of like the flagship title for
Yeah.
that initiative. And so Joe Rybant, my editor on Space Coast, approached me at New York and said, "Hey, listen, I'm sure you saw about this new deal with the Warner Brothers books, and we're doing Space Ghost, and you're the top of the list. We would love for you to write it."
Nice.
And I was so as I kind of like started like looking back into Space Ghost and sort of piecing together what I remembered of it, uh, I realized that there was like a really rich character driven arc to all of this, because all of the previous comics appearances, they were very long form. Like for Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's sort of Batman Begins kind of origin story. Zorak sort of appears in like the last issue very, very briefly. And Jan and Jace kind of don't really factor that much into it. And even like Future Quest, by Jeff Parker and Doc Shanner, Space Ghost kind of bookends that story. He shows up at the beginning, shows up at the end, and I think it's Jan who shows up a little bit more throughout the rest of the narrative. And even Future Quest Presents is more of a jam band thing, where it's Space Ghost and the Herculoids and more of the Hanna-Barbera uh,
Yeah.
uh, characters. So for me, the thing that really stood out was that dynamic between Space Ghost, Jan, and Jace. Back in 1966, nobody batted an eye of why this grown man has two teenagers and a monkey, living with him.
Yeah.
That was just, the style of the time. But
Yeah.
for me, I was kind of like, well, yeah, why wouldn't just Space Ghost drop these kids off at the nearest police station and say peace,
Yeah.
And so that's something that we're really digging into through this series is um, how does Jan and Jace go from being these orphaned rescues to becoming Space Ghost sidekicks and then becoming his trusted partners and then kind of this surrogate found family in their own right, and ultimately kind of giving Space Ghost a new reason to live. So it reminds me a lot of Batman's dynamic with his various sidekicks, but I think
Yeah.
the
I was
big
gonna say.
difference is that Batman's a character that is designed to go on the long haul,
Yeah.
and so you see his sidekicks have a generational element to them. Dick
Mm.
Grayson graduates, and then Jason Todd shows up, and then Jason Todd is killed, and then then Tim Drake steps up, and then Damian Wayne is discovered. He kind of takes over for where Tim was, and that's the cool thing about Space Ghost is that there's no other Jan or Jace. There's no way to just like say, well, here's the new Jace. It's
Yeah.
a personal thing. And I think that gives us a lot of room to allow these characters to grow and allow these
Sure.
characters to change. And so I think having a distinct beginning, middle, and end, which is, I have a little over a year's worth of story planned with room to kind of slot in more
Oh, nice.
if people want it. But yeah, I mean, we get to go on like a full character arc for these
Cool.
characters. And I think that's something that is a lot more challenging to do with a lot of other superheroes because so often you're
Sure.
expected to kind of put the toys back in the toy box
Mhm.
for the next creative team. So not having to do that for Space Ghost, we really get to kind of push these characters and put them in more and more emotional stakes, not just the physical ones, than we're necessarily able to do with superheroes that have to go on for, hundreds and hundreds of issues.
Makes sense. Now, you said you're going to be bringing Space Ghost kind of more modern into the 21st century. Did you
Mhm.
have any specific stories or any inspirations that you drew off to kind of inspire you to, to put into this new story?
Yeah. Well, I would say tonally, we're somewhere between Batman the Animated Series and Batman the Long Halloween.
Okay.
Those were kind of like the two big influences, but
Yeah.
also things like J.J. Abrams' Star Trek.
Okay.
I love the way that's one of my favorite movies, and I love the way that
Yeah.
they take the core of those characters and they're able to kind of give them new context and new nuance in a way
Yeah.
that's like very electrifying
Oh,
for
for sure.
21st century audiences who might not be familiar with those characters.
Yeah.
That first movie in particular is so dynamic and so character driven. That's certainly a big influence. You could also argue things like Lone Wolf and Cub.
Hmm.
That dynamic of
Yeah.
sort of the older hero having to protect the younger ones. I think there's a lot in that as well. But also like even things like it's funny. Machinima did a web series, a Mortal Kombat web series years ago that I think was also a big influence, where you're able to take characters like, they reimagined Jax as like an NYPD detective, and
Oh,
there's
yeah. I remember that.
crime going all around the city, and he's interrogating like I think he's like a Yakuza assassin, a
Yeah.
blind Yakuza assassin, and it turns out that's Scorpion, and we find out that like meanwhile Baraka like used to be like a plastic surgeon who went insane and like installed like giant scalpels into his own arms,
Yeah.
and it's you're taking like the core beats of those characters, and then you're like finding out a way, how do you populate a whole universe today in the most organic way that still speaks to those characters' essences. And so we're doing a lot of that, especially with the villains. Things like Brack, for example. I love Brack because he's not like a world conqueror by any
Yeah.
means, like a dirty pirate mercenary. Like he's the
Yeah.
guy who's just looking to get paid. There's
Yep.
something blue collar about him
Yep.
almost. And so it's like, what kind of wrinkle can we add to him that like really makes him populate this universe in a very fitting and organic way? And I think when readers see that, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, that would track. That's definitely something that Brack would find himself doing. And same thing with like Zorak. I think it's a little reductive to call him the Joker to Space Ghost Batman. And so, we're adding in other kind of strains of like pop culture of how do we kind of elevate him to remind readers of like why he's Space Ghost's like most harrowing villain.
Yeah.
Um, because I think the idea of like a homicidal praying mantis, there's something inherently alien about that.
Yeah.
Like just his physiology, he sees things very differently from Space Ghost. Space Ghost is a man sort of playing at being a monster just by virtue of his name. Zorak is a monster.
Yeah.
And so, that's like a nice, like, kind of, he's savage in a way that like might put Space Ghost on his heels a bit. So doing those sorts of things with the different characters, or even like the Widow. She's the only female member of the Council of Doom, and so as I've written her, seeing the way that she interacts with Jan as like the only girl on her team, and seeing that there's almost like a sick maternal instinct,
Yeah.
for her, and like a weird kind of, she sees a little bit of a kinship with her. Um, those are kind of like fun wrinkles to explore with these characters, and being able to kind of use the done in one format, we're able to really kind of dig in really deep, but also it gives us the ability to when we do use cliffhangers, when we do the occasional two-parter, and it gives our cliffhangers the maximum punch, where that, oh, if this story's not ending, that means Space Ghost is really in it. And that means that it's going to make that comeback in the next installment that much more satisfying.
For sure. Now, there was that Space Ghost book a couple years ago that kind of really dove into the origin of Space Ghost, kind of how everything, came to be. And are we with your book, are we going to see something kind of similar to that where you kind of dive into the background of Space Ghost, or are we just kind of just going to jump in?
Yeah, I mean,
into the
we're
story.
gonna jump in. You know, it's one of those things. We will delve a little bit into Space Ghost Origins, a little bit into our run, but we're not going to be belaboring that point too much. In part because, like you said, the sort of the most prominent comic book adaptation of Space Ghost at this point was very much a Batman Begins kind of
Sure.
origin story for the character.
Yeah,
And for me, I mean, while this is brand new continuity, you do not need to be reading that series in order to get into my series. It's a brand new continuity, so if anything, it might actually contradict. But I think, you know, we're gonna get into Space Ghost Origins. It'll take about 3 pages. You know, it's one of those things that I don't think you need to belabor that point too much. I think what's more interesting to me, I see this as kind of an origin story, more of like the team dynamic of
sure.
of how does Space Ghost first encounter Jan and Jason Blip, and how does their dynamic. You know, he's a guy who, when you first meet him, he knows exactly what to do with a pirate, but he's kind of unwittingly taken on this role of sort of a surrogate single dad,
Yeah,
and that's tough. You know, not only, you know, is just his world not really built for kids, and having these kids there, I think, sort of rubs rubs him the wrong way, for reasons he can't really articulate, which is it reminds him of everything he's lost.
sure.
But as he gets to know these kids better, and as he starts to get more and more kind of, you know, he appreciates them more and starts to get more and more protective. It's the dilemma that any parent has, which is suddenly your heart's running around on the outside.
Yeah,
And, you know, it's a big, dangerous universe out there. And Space Ghost has decided that maybe training these kids is the best way to protect them, from the forces that are after them. But yeah, it's that training doesn't always come without speed bumps.
for
And it's
sure.
they're going to have to navigate those speed bumps together, but ultimately they will come out stronger on the other side of it.
That's cool. And I've heard from a lot of people, and this isn't necessarily the opinion of me or anybody else, but a lot of, movies, TV shows, books, they spend way too much time delving into the origins of how a character became the character he is. Like, let's take, for example, the Incredibles movie. You don't really know how they got all their superpowers. You just know that they have superpowers.
Yeah,
Really, it's I talked to Kurt Busiek on Twitter one time, and he kind of told me, you shouldn't really worry about the powers unless it's relevant to the story. So,
yeah,
like what you said for yours, the more interesting story is not how did Space Ghost become Space Ghost, is how does Space Ghost cope with essentially being a single dad, and not even really being a single dad, just being like an adoptive single dad. So not
yeah.
just so it's that's more of an interesting story. And if for some reason as the story goes on, if it needs to call back to something from his past and explain something from his past, I think that's a much more interesting way to go.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think also, I think as an audience, like I think we're able to kind of figure out the shorthand pretty quickly.
Yeah,
Um, that, you know, Space Ghost is the sole survivor of his planet.
yeah,
And now they call it the Ghost Planet, and that has put him on this mission to stop pirates and hijackers from committing the same crime that, you know, scarred him so badly,
mm,
years ago. And yeah, and I think Jan and Jace then meanwhile kind of have like complementary tragedy, and that's what we kind of get to see from the jump in issue 1.
yeah,
And so yeah, I think. Yeah, it's a fun dynamic, because I think all three of the human characters and Blip, you know, they all kind of deal with their own tragedies in very, very different ways. You know, and sort of watching them play off of each other, that's the real treat of the book for me. I think, you know, you know, you were asking me earlier about like what's harder, licensed books or creator run books, and to be honest, that's not even the question that I would, for me, the question is what's harder, solo books or team books,
uh-huh,
ensemble books. And for me, I love writing ensemble books because then you never get stuck in a rut. You always have characters to kind of play off one another.
sure,
Whereas the single character books that I tend to write, even those I always try to I wind up at least making it a two-hander, you know, with Spencer and Locke, or with Moon Knight City of the Dead, where he teams up with the Scarlet Scarab. The books that it's a single character, something like Punisher, for example. Those are the hardest for me
Sure.
because like you don't have that many people to play off of, and so you
Yeah.
really have to focus on one guy. So something with Space Ghost is great because you have four characters that are. This is of course Space Ghost's book. It's not like we're going to shortchange him, but
Yeah.
it is an ensemble book. Like we're not going to have an issue where like Jan and Jason Blip aren't there. I think that misses the point of the character. I
For
think
sure.
those original cartoons, it's one thing to have one sidekick because then you can say, okay, sometimes the sidekick doesn't show up, and it's very much an accessory to the character.
Yeah.
But having three, that feels like a very pointed. This is their adventures just as much as Space Ghost, and it's a very specific choice, particularly having a monkey, which feels almost like the cherry on top of the sundae.
Yeah.
So I figured out pretty quick that there was no way to tell this story without having all those four characters in it, and it's made for a really fun experience.
Very cool. Well, I'm very excited. Like you said, Space Ghost, The Ghost Rises comes out in May. So make sure everybody get on pre-order with your local comic shop, or if you don't have a local comic shop, get on the web. Let's get it pre-ordered so we can make sure we get more Space Ghost in the future. Now, sir, is there anything else coming up from you that you can talk about that you want to share with everybody?
Yeah, well, sure. You can also pre-order the last issue of my creator-owned horror series, The Devil That Wears My Face, through Mad Cave Studios. That book is Face Off meets The Exorcist. So that's
Uh,
been a super fun book
yeah, my
about
friend, my friend Hassel got to take a look at I think it was the first issue and do a review.
yeah.
He's a huge fan.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a really fun book. Issue 6 is coming out May 8th, the week after Space Ghost #1. And yeah, I'm so thrilled with the work that Alex Cormack has done on that book. But yeah, it's about a priest who accidentally swaps bodies with a demon. So he is trapped in a possessed man's body, and the demon has stolen his body to wreak havoc at the
Man.
Vatican. And things have gone very, very poorly for the Vatican
Oh man.
over the course of our series. And our priest has to come back for one last fight. So that's been really fun. Moon Knight City of the Dead, the trade paperback, is out for that. We introduced Layla Al Fawley as the all-new Scarlet Scarab from the Disney Plus show into the Marvel Universe. That was a very fun book. I believe you should be able to pre-order my trade paperback for Punisher if I would imagine in the next couple of weeks. So if you missed out on our 4-issue miniseries, you can get to meet Joe Garrison, Marvel's all new Punisher, in that trade. So tell your local comic shop you want that. And yeah, those are I think the three projects that I've kind of been juggling most recently. But yeah, all my books, Savage Avengers, Scouts Honor, Spencer and Locke, Going to the Chapel, they all should be available wherever comics are sold.
Very cool. And one last thing I want to ask, because I try to ask this of everybody, if you had a bit of advice for creatives, what would it
Sure.
be?
I've got a couple bits of advice.
Okay.
I want to start small. Finishing something is way more important than kind of doing like a long form anything. When I taught myself how to write, I was doing it with short scripts first, like 6 to 8 pages, and they
Yeah.
don't have to be good. They just have to be finished because you'll learn every time. Like, oh, okay, like this is what sucks. I will get that for the next time. Um, you know, Dessert First is the other one. Just because you read something in order doesn't mean you have to write it that way. I write whatever comes to mind first, because that way, like um, I can then kind of I'm not looking at a blank page anymore. So I
Yeah.
think like those are like the two big bits of advice. And I guess the third one is honestly, I don't knock fan fiction. Fan fiction is a great way to learn how to write.
Sure.
Like learning how to kind of pace a story and put a story together. You can focus on coming up with your own characters after you kind of learn how to make a story. But if you're not going to publish it, but like if just learning, getting your reps in, sure, write a Spider-Man story if that's what speaks to you. If that's what'll
Yeah.
teach you how to write your own stuff, great. So yeah, I think those are the three bits of advice. Is just, start small, write out of order, and when all else fails, write the characters you know.
There you go. Perfect. All right. So where can we stay up to date on stuff coming from you? Where can we catch you on
Yeah.
online?
You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Pepose D, David Pepose Comics on Facebook. You can subscribe to my newsletter, Pep Talks, at bit.ly/pep news, or visit my website, davidpepose.com. It's currently under construction. We got hit with some hackers, but that should be fixed relatively soon.
Nice. Well, to stay up to date with this interview, lots of other geek news and interviews, make sure you check out our website at geek-network.com. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at GeeksAZ, Geek Network on Facebook. You can follow the show at Fueled by Weird on Instagram. The Polygon Horizons, the band that does the music for the show, go check them out on Bandcamp. They're a bunch of great guys. Chris Chandler and Mike Belcher are two great comic guys that do the logos for my show. So go check them out and so give them some love. And if you like the show, please leave a review and tell your friends because word of mouth is our friend. And remember, kids, to embrace the things that fuel your weird and always geek responsibly. David, thanks so much for spending the evening with me.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.